Okay, good evening to all. I'm very honored to be here. I'm sorry for not being present on Monday morning. There was just a little confusion in the planning and invitation. I'm really really sorry about that. But I'm very pleased now to be among you. Um, Patrick invited me to come over here to talk to you, and eventually it is, I suppose, as an ecological activist, which I am, and with eventually Christian background, which I try to have. And I think it's the best thing I can tell you this evening. It's about precisely the type of experience of what it means for a Christian to be an ecological activist in some points, and the type of experience of a spiritual experience I may take out of that, and eventually with the scriptures as well. As I'm not an exeget like you are, um, I'm not pretending to do a full exegesis here. Just in a few words about me, is that of course I was born and I grew up in a Christian family, and which was with a strong fervor, and and eventually I went at some point of my life in a seminar, so with a project to be a priest, but I didn't go to the end. I stopped a couple of years before the end. But I think that was a very important moment in my life to become an activist. So this is why I find it's much more a point of spiritual theology than a point of scriptures but I think the fact is that at that moment I really felt like maybe in a moment like this, when you decide to change your way and to stop a project in which that was very important to you, and to renunciate to that project, it's a bit like you feel some failure. Eventually you feel very much alone, but it's a moment where you have some great spiritual graces as well. And I never felt much more at that moment, at that very moment, that what it means to be a son of God, a son of a father. And it was not like as if you would be praying in front of a cross like the beloved apostle, but it was much more like praying on the cross, like being crucified with Christ. So it was like and you really feel something like what it means to hear the words, "This is my beloved son." And at that moment, for me, it was very clear that I tasted the sense and the feeling of action in the way Hannah Arendt defines action. It's an action that is very performative in the public sphere. You really feel free to behave in the public sphere as son of God. It's maybe a very guru kind of speech to say that, but it meant a lot. I think for me, my ecological activism is precisely rooted in that moment in my life. When I left the seminary, I really felt the sense of being son of God, of son of a father. And I often say that my faith is much more father-centered than Christ-centered. Christ being kind of the way for me. And it's very important, because this is where I had the courage, the nerve to act in the public sphere and to take action at some moment. So actually, when I came back from the seminary in France to Mauritius, just at that moment, there was an important conflict that was taking place between NGOs and the government to stop the construction of a highway through one of the two primary forests of the country. And it's important to know that only 2% of the Mauritian territory is still covered with primary forest. So I really felt at ease to get into that fight at that moment. And it's precisely a moment where actually activism developed also my sense for ecology, and ecology moved myself and encouraged myself to get further into that path, into that way. It's not something that was completely defined at the beginning. It's only when you get into it that you develop the knowledge, you develop the know-how. So I realized at that moment what it means when we talk about the fragility of ecosystems and the speed at which it was possible for man to eradicate other forms of life. I integrated into my ethics two important notions of responsibility: the responsibility towards future generations and responsibility towards that which is smaller and more fragile than oneself, even an individual and of another species than the human species. And so this was the first discovering and understanding of the meanings of ecology to me at that moment in 2005. And just shortly after that, a more violent fight was to take place, and it was against a waste incineration project. This may sound like a good idea to many people, but it is not. It had two major drawbacks. First, the residual ashes that would be buried in the soil represented a threat to the country's water tables. And the other major drawback was that the project contractually obliged the Mauritian government to supply their incinerator with a minimum of 400,000 tons of waste per year, or face exorbitant penalties. With such a contract, it became impossible to engage in a policy that would encourage the reduction of waste production. On the contrary, our society was condemned to consume and throw away more and more. We were in a dead end. In this situation, how to get out of this addictive consumer society which produces waste and causes the planetary damages. So I was myself at that moment the coordinator of a campaign at national level, and we had to organize demonstrations. We were in 2009, and I quickly realized how difficult it was to get massive popular support. In fact, political awareness of Mauritians is very low on everything that has to do with common good, unfortunately, in our country, and this is due to anthropological and social reasons that I'm not going to address here. Still, in this fight, it seemed necessary to me to get closer to trade union platforms. So we found ourselves with a union demonstrating side by side in the streets of the capital, and this experience immediately opened my eyes to the fact that ecological questions could in no way be dissociated from the social question. The two aspects are intrinsically linked. It became an irreducible evidence ecology is above all a political subject. And whatever I may say in the rest of my speech, I want to emphasize that this point seems to me the most important. And the fight against waste incineration was an excellent revelation of this. It brought awareness to how we collectively choose or don't choose to provide for ourselves as a human community. This is not a matter of individual choice or responsibility. More than that, it also raised awareness on how our fellow human beings are exposed to chemical pollution. By incidence, it made us aware of the fundamental right of each human being to have access to a clean and healthy nature. This is obvious, since this nature is co-natural to us. Every human being depends on air and water for his or her very existence. It is therefore right to be guaranteed from birth to have access to a free and healthy nature. It is necessary to have a nature that has not been confiscated either in space or time by private interests. And soil pollution is a confiscation of land, it is a confiscation of water, it is a confiscation of air. And here I want to warn against the temptation to reduce ecological question to a moral question or an economic question that would simply aim to make production or consumption patterns more responsible. I will come back on that a little later. In other words, the ecological question must not be reduced to a personalist anthropology. aimed at defining a relationship between man and nature. This is why I'm not satisfied with an ecological exegesis based on the story of creation in the book of Genesis. I have a feeling that this account too often tends to feed this perception. Once again, ecology is above all the question of a social fact. It is a question by which humans manage to live together and to remain together, alive, over a very long term. And after that fight against waste incineration, we developed a platform to federate all the NGOs for ecology in Mauritius, and I had the honor to be the spokesperson for that platform of NGOs during 6 years. And it was very interesting to notice the diverse backgrounds of all these NGOs, with all different philosophical baggage and existential aspirations. This shows precisely the political nature of ecology, and it shows, unfortunately, how far away we are from the emergence of a clear and new political framework for our world. I will not tell you today the whole story of the actions led by the Mauritian Platform for Environment that still exists today, but I can tell you that at the heart of these fights, we really measure the devastating madness of our humanity. This madness can be linked to a logic of grabbing. Of course, I am thinking here of a coral island off the coast of Mauritius, which was in a pristine state and which had been given by the Mauritian government to a friend of a prime minister so that he could turn it into a paying destination for tourists. Of course, at no time the environmental issue was addressed, nor the question of greater good for the Mauritian community. This madness can also be linked to a complete inversion of values. For example, in the name of the sacrosanct economic development, one can justify all kinds of aberrations. I am thinking here of a coal-fired power plant project with a capacity of 100 megawatts that a private consortium was planning to build with the blessing of the government. Just think about it. In addition to the climatic impacts of all these carbon emissions, this project was to be built in a still preserved area of a Mauritian coastline on top of a splendid and pristine cliffs and close to a residential area. In this type of situation, it is not so much the prospect of a fight to be waged that is frightening, as the staggering impression that common sense has deserted and left us alone. How to dialogue with the authorities when we are obviously in totally different cognitive universe? It is obvious that two radically different perceptions of the world are opposed here. So much so that this situation pushed one of our friends within these NGOs to go on a hunger strike that lasted 19 days. This was precisely to create a shock of consciousness. The most surprising thing about this type of fight is that we, the ecologists, are often accused of having too extreme, too radical behaviors. But then, can you please explain to me what can be more radical than destroying a beautiful site full of life, full of biodiversity, where human communities live peacefully, to put a coal power plant at the top of it? If this is not radical, then what is? This inversion of values, this darkening of consciences, is that no longer allows any discernment, is, I believe, the most tragic thing about what we are experiencing today. I could summon Hannah Arendt again here, especially in her reflections on the origin of evil from the Nazi experience. She concluded that the evil that settled in a community was nothing more than a huge bubble of human stupidity that was commonly shared and that found its origin in a lie accepted by all. And that the ground for this was a world that had become confused without cardinal values. And so for this core PowerPoint, I wonder if it's not like a structure of sin kind of thing that guided this type of reflection. Thanks to this experience acquired in NGO, I also decided after that to launch a pioneering consulting company in Mauritius to assist companies in their ecological transition. In fact, this global ecological crisis crosses all spheres of human affairs. In the corporate world, it is epitomized by the notion of corporate social responsibility. In fact, this concept is not new. It emerged in management school some 60 years ago, but never really gained unanimity until about 20 years or so. Frankly, this managerial ethic neither questions the economic model in which our planet has been evolving for the last 4 centuries, nor does it question the entrepreneurial model itself. To put it in a simplistic manner, companies tend to see nature as an infinite and worthless resource that anyone can take and degrade as they please. It is only when the company gets its hands on these natural resources that they suddenly take on a financial value. Before that, this exceptional wealth does not appear anywhere in the economy or in the public accounts. And I can tell you that when you are debating with foolish economic development fanatics, this kind of information would have been very useful to make them see reason. The fact remains that the environmental impacts of companies, which are now called negative externalities, have started to become more and more significant over time. You are already aware of the scale of the disaster, the accumulation of carbon dioxide that changes the climate regime of the planet, the collapse of all forms of life on Earth that has become chronic now, and the presence of pollution everywhere. Of course, production and consumption patterns are directly at fault, but the cost of this disaster has never been imputed to companies, whereas it has always been borne by human communities. This means that it is always the poorest or most fragile who pay the consequences. Today, these externalities are better assessed and considered by companies with the aim of successfully internalizing their cost. This is where we see an evolution in management ethics. In this field, there are 2 philosophical currents that have been confronting each other for 60 years. The first is rooted in the principle of entrepreneurial freedom and establishes the responsibility of a company at the level of a decision maker, in his or her personal relationship to good and evil. The other is rooted in the principle of citizenship of any legal body and their accountability for all decisions that can affect the community. Obviously, I am more comfortable with the second approach, since ecology is gregarious in nature and cannot be reduced to a personalizing ontology. Alongside this management ethic, ecological issues are also entering the business world through the prism of risk management. With a depletion of natural resources and the increase of disasters, companies also realize that their future is at stake and that they need to better anticipate. And as the shrewd manager says in Luke 16, when he finds himself up against the wall, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job." In other words, what shall I do when my future is ruined? Well, we all know what he does, since he buys back the debt of the debtors. In a way, CSR is a bit like that. Companies measure the amount of risk they face if all the predicted disasters were to occur. And since the future is constrained, then they try to find ways out, sometimes with innovating intelligently. Sometimes they innovate intelligently, and sometimes they fictiously redeem themselves through storytelling. Unfortunately, we must not forget that this pericope also concludes with this pithy sentence: "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." All this CSR is still insufficient to solve the ecological challenges of our time. At this rate, our planet will be like a patient who has died once cured. And of course, I'm not satisfied with this situation. And others face the same dilemma in this business world. So much so that some companies are trying to revolutionize the business model from within and are making even more radical commitments. They are called benefit corporations. It's a type of company whose mission is to serve the social and environmental betterment of the planet. Service companies exist primarily for the greater good rather than for profit. There is an international certification to recognize them. It is a B Corp label. I couldn't resist to the temptation to have my company certified as a B Corp. Actually, we are the first certified consultant in French-speaking Africa, and I was recently talking to the headquarter team who are responsible for managing this label in Africa, and they are based in Kenya. And they were pointing out to me that the label in Africa is working well with companies from a Western culture, but the certification had more difficulty in attracting the interest of specifically African companies. And we agreed that the important thing was not the certification itself, but to encourage African companies to invent new models that suited them. This is typically the spirit of an ecological approach, I believe. How can diversity listen to each other? How can we leave room for the emergence of otherness without being affected by it? Environmental activism through business is today the ultimate format of my journey. For example, 2 years ago, the country was shocked to discover that a huge cargo ship, the Wakasho, had sunk on the coral reef. This resulted in the largest oil spill we ever had, and precisely in what is probably the most beautiful marine park on our island. This shock was a turning point in the consciousness of the Mauritians and led to what was probably the largest citizen mobilization in Mauritius. The authorities mismanaged the situation, and worst of all, they did not disclose any information related to pollution, fish contamination, and public health. At that time, we were coming out of 3 months of strict confinement because of COVID. Low-income families were in a great financial distress, and now the local fishermen were banned from fishing. In return, they were given a symbolic and clearly insufficient financial compensation. Faced with such an omission on the part of the authorities, we decided to make use of the company's expertise to prepare a report on the socio-economic impacts of the oil spill. We compiled statistics and interviewed 800 people voluntarily. We then published the report online and for free. The aim was that all citizens could be respected and treated as adults in the face of this disaster. From a scientific point of view, this study was also very instructive. It confirmed that it confirmed in Mauritius, or for Mauritius, what predictive models already say at international level. We discovered that the poorest people are also the most fragile, meaning the least resilient and the least autonomous in the face of a natural disaster. The issue is important because we know that with climate change, natural disasters will be more frequent and more important in the future. In the specific case of the Wakasho disaster, we first observed that the closure of all economic activities during the COVID forced modest families to develop survival strategies thanks to the natural resources available, especially marine resources available in the lagoon. Some families went into a little debt, but reasonably so. But 3 months after, with the Wakasho's shipwreck, with the oil spill and the closure of all access to the sea, poor families lost all flexibility. They were no longer resilient. Some became over-indebted. Others sold their productive capital, such as their motorcycles, to get to work, or their boat engines. They had thus restarted the vicious circle that will lead them into extreme poverty. In the face of a coming climate change, it is therefore vital to allow everyone to have free access to quality natural resources. So when I look to the biblical text from my perspective as an environmentalist, I am left rather perplexed. The biblical author is, as on all ethical and political matters, very composite or very poor. I will pick out a few random elements. To begin simplistically, many biblical authors practicing immanent justice appears to be rather consistent in inflicting natural disaster as punishment for human injustice. Political disorder and social injustice have an effect on nature, which then turns against human beings. It is basic, but in today's world it works, unfortunately. And it is even more ironic that until about 30 years ago, thinking that nature could impose itself as a punishment for the excesses of human society was still considered by science to be magical thinking. And Noah with his ark appeared to be the first conservationist of biodiversity. In the end, what better promise of life, what better promise about a future can God make to Noah's descendants than to offer them a preserved biodiversity? So divine punishment does take this into account. But not only a punishment. In Bible, nature is in turn the demonstration of God's abundant providence towards mankind, whether it is in the manna in the desert or the promised land full of milk and honey. The proof of the power and glory of the Creator, as we see much in the book of Psalms. The world of idols, and therefore a dead end to be wary of, like in the book of Wisdom, where I can quote the phrase, "For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan, while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world." So, but in my opinion, all these texts give clues. They help to outline the ecological question. They may say what not to do, but at this stage, and I hope you will prove me wrong, I do not see in the biblical content a very clear corpus capable of accounting for human communities and their good life in an organic and integrated way with the whole of creation. As I said, ecology is above all political. It implies a relationship of interdependence between all parts of a system, and all choices must be made in a way that favors the autonomy and resilience of the said system. Perhaps the fact that nature is so quick to give us in abundance or to punish us according to our good or bad behavior is enough to demonstrate the organic link between man and between the human beings and creation. But probably the passage that best captures a certain political ecology would be in the Gospel of Matthew. "Look at the birds of the air, they do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" The exegetical answer to the ecological question seems unsolvable from the start. The whole biblical narrative, it seems to me, is oriented on the call of a people, Jewish or Christian. It is about its election, that is to say about its singularization out of its original condition and in virtue of a finality established in God. How then can we find the way to resituate the human community within a creation in which all created things are interdependent? Unless this call of God that makes us his sons and daughters is extended to all creation. Just as St. Paul extended the gospel to the nations 2,000 years ago, should we extend the gospel to all creation today? And why not? The song of the three children in Daniel 3 inspires us. "And you mountains and hills, oh bless the Lord, and you all plants of the earth, oh bless the Lord, and you fountains and springs, oh bless the Lord. To him be highest glory and praise forever." And who are we to stop the creation to bless the Lord? I don't know if you have the exegesis answer to that.
Merci beaucoup Thierry. Tu as bien dit que tu es un activiste. Tu n'es pas quelqu'un qui fait seulement des études de la Bible pour savoir ce que c'est que l'écologie et comment la Bible nous parle de l'écologie, mais tu es un activiste et tu nous as montré ton évolution dans cette question et tu es devenu activiste en faisant. C'est quand tu as pris position concernant une route qui devrait être bâtie que tu as compris que c'était ton combat. Et c'est un combat qui a évolué et surtout tu nous montres comment tu es arrivé à former ta propre compagnie. et que tu es en contact avec l'Afrique et que tu as eu ton siège. Le siège est au Kenya, tu as été au Kenya.
Ouais.
Hein, et que donc là, ce qui est exactement ce que nous faisons, nous sommes en lien avec l'Afrique et donc tu essayes de dire comment ça peut avancer dans la question de l'écologie. Mais surtout, tu as découvert que l'écologie, c'est une question sociale, c'est une question politique, c'est une question d'interdépendance et que c'est un long combat. Et ce que tu demandes, c'est que à la fois les gens sont pas très conscients, hein, que c'est un combat, il faut parler. Tu dis tu es the spokesman, the spokesperson of the group, il faut parler. Mais en t'écoutant, tu trouves dans la Bible des éléments qui te ressourcent pour mener ce combat. Alors c'est un peu ce que j'ai entendu quand tu as parlé, et je crois que nous avons apprécié. We appreciate this activist, not only someone who thinks, but an activist. Are you having a question? A question? Something? Okay. So thank you very much, Thierry.
Merci,
Thank you very much.
thank you.